imposing retaliatory tariffs right now on the United States, hitting billions of dollars worth of goods and energy resources.
Or even a bipolar conflict between China and the United States.
Over the past few decades, the global economy has undergone a major shift, challenging America's long-standing dominance and creating a more competitive landscape in international trade. For much of modern history, the United States has been at the heart of global commerce. With its vast economy, financial strength, and worldwide influence, the US had the power to impose tariffs, taxes, and trade restrictions without facing serious repercussions. When America decided to cut trade ties with certain nations, those countries had little choice but to comply, especially if their economies relied heavily on trade with the US. This influence was further reinforced by the US dollar being the world's reserve currency and many key financial institutions being based in America. However, the world today is vastly different from what it was just a few decades ago. One of the most significant changes has been the rise of China, a nation that has rapidly emerged as an economic superpower. This shift in global power has created new challenges for the US, particularly as China continues to strengthen its manufacturing sector, expand its technological advancements, and increase its footprint in global trade. With this transformation, the dynamics of international commerce have shifted dramatically. The ongoing US-China trade war is a direct consequence of this changing balance. Tensions escalated in 2018 when the Trump administration imposed tariffs on Chinese imports, arguing that China was engaging in unfair trade practices. The US government accused China of using strategies like forced technology transfers, intellectual property theft, and government subsidies to give its industries an unfair edge. By implementing tariffs, the US aimed to address what it saw as an unfair trade imbalance, reduce its growing trade deficit, and encourage American companies to bring manufacturing jobs back home. The initial US tariff was set at 10% on a wide range of Chinese products worth hundreds of billions of dollars. While this move was intended to strengthen American industries and lessen reliance on Chinese imports, it quickly led to unexpected consequences. China did not take these restrictions lightly and immediately responded with its own tariffs on American goods. Beijing strategically targeted sectors crucial to the US economy, with agriculture being one of the hardest hit. As China reduced its purchases of US farm products, American farmers faced significant financial strain. At first, many assumed that the US would have the upper hand in the trade war. After all, for decades, it had dominated global trade and shaped international markets through its economic policies. However, the situation proved to be far more complex. China, once thought to be deeply dependent on the US, had evolved into a far more resilient economic power. Over the years, it had diversified its trade relationships, strengthened partnerships with other major economies, and built a robust domestic market. As a result, China was far better positioned to withstand US economic pressure than many had initially expected. China's response to US tariffs made it clear that the global economy was no longer operating under the same rules as before. In the past, when the US imposed tariffs or sanctions on a country, that nation often had limited ways to retaliate. But China had the economic strength to push back, and it did so with precision. Rather than simply matching US tariffs with identical measures, China strategically targeted key American industries where it could cause the most harm. This included imposing heavy tariffs on US agricultural exports and tightening restrictions on American businesses operating within China. What followed was a back-and-forth trade war, with both sides continuously escalating tariffs and restrictions. neither country showed any signs of backing down, and the economic fallout extended far beyond just the US and China. Businesses that depended on supply chains linking both economies found themselves struggling with rising costs and uncertainty. Investors became increasingly anxious about the long-term impact on global markets, fearing that prolonged tensions could trigger a wider economic downturn. One major takeaway from this trade war is that economic power is no longer as one-sided as it once was. The era when the US could impose trade restrictions without significant retaliation is fading. China has proven that it has both the economic resilience and strategic capabilities to counter US policies in ways that create serious consequences. This shift is reshaping the way nations approach trade, making negotiations more complex and increasing the risk of prolonged economic standoffs. While the US initially imposed tariffs to boost domestic industries and bring jobs back home, the actual results have been far more complicated. Some sectors benefited from the new trade policies, but others suffered due to rising costs and restricted access to Chinese markets. Many American businesses that relied on Chinese components saw their expenses increase, forcing them to either raise prices for consumers or cut back on operations. Meanwhile, China adapted by diversifying its supply chains and strengthening trade relationships with other countries, reducing its dependence on the US. The US-China trade war has also underscored just how deeply interconnected the global economy has become. In a world where supply chains span multiple continents, a single trade policy can create ripple effects that impact businesses and consumers worldwide. Tariffs meant to protect domestic industries can end up disrupting entire markets, leading to unintended consequences that affect economies far beyond the countries involved. As the conflict continues, one of the biggest questions is whether the US will adjust its approach or stay the course. Some policymakers argue that the trade war is necessary to curb China's growing influence and secure long-term economic security for the US. Others believe the strategy has done more harm than good, and that a new, more effective approach is needed to navigate the complexities of global trade. What is clear is that the world is changing. The US is no longer the only major economic force shaping global markets, and China is proving that it has the ability to compete on an equal footing. As this shift continues, trade policies will need to evolve to reflect the new economic realities. Whether the US and China can find a way to reach a more stable trade relationship remains to be seen. But what is certain is that the decisions made in the coming years will have a lasting impact on the global economy. The principle of cause and effect remains as relevant as ever. The tariffs imposed by the US led to a direct response from China, which in turn triggered further economic adjustments. This cycle of action and reaction continues to shape international trade, influencing everything from the cost of consumer goods to the stability of global financial markets. As tensions persist, businesses, policymakers, and consumers alike must navigate a world where economic relationships are more complex and interdependent than ever before. One of the key areas where China has made significant strides is in manufacturing. In the 1990s and early 2000s, China was primarily seen as a low-cost producer, relying on cheap labor and foreign investment to fuel its growth. At that time, many Western companies moved their production to China to take advantage of its lower costs, contributing to the rapid expansion of Chinese industry. However, over the years, China has transitioned from being a country that simply assembles goods to one that leads in advanced manufacturing and industrial production. Today, China is the world's largest manufacturing hub, producing everything from smartphones and electronics to automobiles and heavy machinery. Its industrial base has grown to the point where it no longer relies as heavily on foreign companies to drive its economy. Instead, Chinese firms have become global leaders in innovation and production, competing directly with American and European companies. The rise of Chinese brands in industries such as technology, electric vehicles, and renewable energy has demonstrated that China is not just catching up. It is setting the pace in many areas. A prime example of this is the rapid expansion of China's automotive industry. In recent years, Chinese automakers have taken significant steps toward becoming global leaders, particularly in the electric vehicle (EV) market. Companies like BYD, NIO, and XPeng have developed cutting-edge EVs that rival those produced by Tesla, Ford, and General Motors. With strong government support, China has positioned itself as the world's largest producer of electric vehicles, exporting its cars to markets across Europe, Asia, and even North America. The Chinese government has been a major force behind this transformation. By providing subsidies, investing in infrastructure, and implementing policies that drive local innovation, China has built an environment where its industries can flourish. Unlike the United States, where private companies mostly operate without significant government support, Chinese businesses benefit from direct state backing. This enables them to scale rapidly and compete more aggressively on the global stage. This shift is especially visible in the electric vehicle (EV) market, where government-funded incentives have helped Chinese automakers expand both domestically and internationally. Meanwhile, US car manufacturers are facing mounting challenges. Giants like Ford and General Motors, which have dominated the American auto industry for decades, are now struggling to keep pace with China's rapid technological advancements. Manufacturing costs in the US remain much higher than in China due to factors like labor wages, supply chain disruptions, and rising material prices. In addition, many American automakers still rely on outdated production methods, making it even harder for them to compete. While China's factories continue to embrace automation and efficiency, one of the biggest setbacks for the US auto industry has been retaliatory tariffs from China. In response to US-imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, China introduced a 10% tax on American-made cars, raising the total cost of exporting a US vehicle to China to a hefty 25%. This move has directly impacted major players like Tesla, Ford, and GM, which had long depended on China as a key market for expansion. The added tax has made selling cars in China far more expensive, making it harder for American brands to compete with local manufacturers. But China isn't just competing on price anymore, it's competing on innovation. Companies like BYD are leading the charge in battery technology, producing electric vehicles that are not only more affordable, but also more efficient. With China's strong push towards sustainability and renewable energy, the country is rapidly emerging as the world's leader in green technology, while the US struggles to keep up. These trade tensions are affecting far more than just the auto industry. As China cements its status as a global manufacturing powerhouse, other American industries are feeling the heat. The tech sector, for example, has taken a major hit due to the ongoing trade war. US companies that once relied on Chinese suppliers for key components like semiconductors and batteries now face rising costs and supply chain disruptions. At the same time, Chinese firms are ramping up domestic production, reducing their dependence on US technology and becoming stronger competitors in critical fields like artificial intelligence and telecommunications. One of the key reasons behind China's rapid economic rise is its ability to adapt quickly. Unlike many Western nations, where political deadlock can delay policy changes for years, China's government can make swift decisions that directly shape its industries. This flexibility has allowed Chinese companies to respond to market shifts in ways that many US firms simply cannot. When the US imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, China didn't just absorb the impact. It pivoted by expanding trade with other nations, securing new markets, and adjusting production strategies to minimize losses. This adaptability has given China a major edge in the global economy. While the US has focused on imposing trade restrictions and using tariffs to protect its industries, China has taken a more forward-thinking approach by investing in its long-term economic future. A key example of this is the Belt and Road Initiative, which strengthens trade partnerships across Asia, Africa, and Europe. By building infrastructure and securing trade agreements with other countries, China has reduced its reliance on the US market, making itself less vulnerable to American economic policies. Meanwhile, the US has struggled to keep pace with these shifts. The ongoing trade war has created uncertainty for many American businesses, making long-term planning more difficult. Industries that once thrived on international trade are now dealing with shrinking exports, limited market access, and rising costs. This impact is being felt across multiple sectors, including agriculture, manufacturing, and technology. Perhaps one of the biggest risks for the US is that while it remains focused on restricting China through tariffs and trade barriers, other nations are strengthening their economic ties with Beijing. Countries in Europe, Africa, and South America are increasing their trade with China, recognizing the advantages of working with a fast-growing economy. As a result, the US risks isolating itself from global trade opportunities while China continues to expand its economic influence. A major concern in the US-China trade war is the increasing risk of economic decoupling. For decades, the two nations have been deeply interconnected through trade, investment, and supply chains. Businesses on both sides have relied on each other for raw materials, manufacturing, and technological components. But with rising tariffs, stricter regulations, and growing tensions, both countries are now moving toward reducing their economic dependence on one another. This process, known as decoupling, could have profound consequences for global trade and economic stability. For the US, decoupling from China means trying to bring manufacturing back home or relocating production to countries like Mexico, Vietnam, or India. While this might seem like a win for American workers, the reality is far more complex. Manufacturing in the US is significantly more expensive due to higher wages, strict regulations, and logistical challenges. Companies that once relied on low-cost Chinese labor can't just move their operations without facing massive financial hurdles. Even when businesses attempt to shift production elsewhere, they quickly realize that China's well-developed infrastructure, efficient supply chains, and manufacturing expertise are incredibly difficult to replace. The impact of decoupling is already being felt across industries that depend on Chinese imports, including consumer electronics, auto manufacturing, and construction materials. With tariffs driving up the cost of Chinese goods, many businesses have no choice but to pass those extra expenses on to consumers. As a result, American households are paying more for everything from smartphones to household appliances, making everyday life increasingly expensive. Some companies have tried to absorb these higher costs, but many are struggling to stay competitive in an already tough economic climate. One of the hardest hit sectors is the auto industry. China's retaliatory tariffs on American-made cars have made them far more expensive for Chinese consumers, effectively pushing US automakers out of the market. This has been a major setback for companies like Ford and General Motors, which had long relied on China's massive customer base to boost sales. With a 25% tariff on US vehicles, Chinese buyers are now turning to locally produced cars, further strengthening China's domestic auto industry. Meanwhile, US automakers, already dealing with rising costs, are left at a serious disadvantage. The steel tariffs introduced during the Trump administration were meant to protect American steelworkers and boost domestic production. But the reality hasn't played out as expected. While the US does produce its own steel, it isn't enough to meet national demand. The tariffs have made steel more expensive, driving up costs for American manufacturers that rely on it. This in turn has increased the prices of everything from cars to construction materials, placing even more financial strain on businesses and consumers. For the US auto industry, these rising steel costs have been particularly damaging. Cars require large amounts of steel and aluminum, and as material costs climb, manufacturing vehicles in the US becomes more expensive. This puts additional pressure on automakers already struggling to compete with lower-cost foreign manufacturers. Even if US companies move production out of China, they still face high costs at home, making it difficult to stay profitable in an increasingly competitive global market. As a result of these challenges, US automakers are exploring new strategies to stay competitive. Some are doubling down on electric vehicles, EVs, aiming to carve out a stronger position in a market increasingly dominated by China. Others are focusing on automation and efficiency to lower production costs. But despite these efforts, the reality is clear. China's auto industry is expanding at a rapid pace, and the US is struggling to keep up. Beyond the automotive sector, other industries are also feeling the pressure. The technology sector, long a pillar of US-China economic ties, is experiencing major disruptions. Companies like Apple and Tesla, which rely heavily on Chinese manufacturing, are facing rising costs and supply chain instability. Meanwhile, Chinese tech firms are making groundbreaking advances in artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and telecommunications, positioning themselves as formidable rivals to US companies. Nowhere is this shift more evident than in the semiconductor industry. For decades, American giants like Intel, Qualcomm, and Nvidia have led global semiconductor production. However, China has been pouring billions into developing its own semiconductor capabilities, aiming to reduce dependence on US technology. In response, the US government has imposed strict export controls on advanced semiconductor technology, fearing that it could be used for military and surveillance purposes. This move has further strained relations and pushed China to accelerate its domestic chip development, fueling a new tech race. The ripple effects of the trade war extend far beyond the US and China, reshaping global supply chains. Many companies that once relied on Chinese factories are scrambling to find alternative suppliers in Asia, Latin America, and even the US. But replicating China's efficient manufacturing ecosystem is no small feat. The country has spent decades perfecting its supply chains, and while some businesses have managed to diversify their operations, many still find themselves reliant on China for critical components and raw materials. As the US and China continue to compete for economic dominance, a pressing question remains: what's next? Will the US double down on tariffs and trade restrictions, or will efforts be made to negotiate a new economic agreement? Can China sustain its current pace of growth, or will it encounter roadblocks that slow its rise? These unanswered questions will shape the future of global trade for years to come. One thing is certain: the trade war is far from over. Even as new administrations take office and economic policies shift, the core competition between the US and China isn't going away. The world is watching as the two largest economies navigate an increasingly complex relationship, one with consequences that stretch far beyond their own borders. The decisions made today will shape not only businesses and consumers, but also the global economic landscape for generations to come. For American industries, the challenge is clear: staying competitive in a world where China's influence continues to grow. This may require a fundamental shift in strategy, one that prioritizes innovation, efficiency, and new markets over reliance on tariffs and trade barriers. Meanwhile, China faces its own set of challenges, from maintaining economic stability to managing trade partnerships and addressing growing concerns from other global powers. As the global economy continues to evolve, the US and China will remain at the center of it all. Whether this rivalry escalates into further conflict or opens doors for new cooperation remains to be seen. What is undeniable, however, is that we are entering a new era of economic competition, one that demands adaptability, strategic foresight, and a deep understanding of an increasingly interconnected world.